In the year 2000, a country dared to say enough is enough. They took back their land that had been stolen from their grandfathers. And for that, the world made them pay.
We are not a British colony. You must know that. We are not a British colony.
I told them that we have come to occupy your farm.
The process of reform, land reform, involved their having to hand over the land.
How do you feel about Mr. Mugabe's victory?
I think it stinks.
Are you going to stay in Rhodesia?
I don't think so.
The UK is trying to teach us how to run our country. Naturally, we resist that. We do not accept.
You have probably heard the story of Zimbabwe. Hyperinflation, economic collapse, billion-dollar bills worth less than a toilet paper. And these stories are repeated in every Western newsroom every time they talk about Mugabe and Zimbabwe. And at the end of the day, what they say is that Mugabe was a madman. He destroyed his own country. Here's the question that gets buried under 20 layers of carefully arranged narrative. And the question is, why did Zimbabwe's economy collapse only after the West got involved? Because what happened to Zimbabwe was not just an economic crisis, it was a punishment. They wanted the whole of Africa to see what happens when you speak back to your masters. It was a coordinated, deliberate, ruthless punishment delivered by the most powerful nations on earth against a small African country that had the nerve to give land back to its people. Hi, my name is Kelvin Biriot, a digital entrepreneur, and today, me and my team, we are going to tell you every single detail, the history they erased, the agreements they broke, the sanctions they deployed, and the millions of lives caught in the crossfire. This is the price Zimbabwean people paid. Before we talk about what the Western countries did to Zimbabwe, we have to go back, way back, not to 2000, not to 1980. We have to go back to the moment the theft began. Long before a single European boot touched the soil of what is now Zimbabwe, this land was alive. A civilization of extraordinary depth, Great Zimbabwe. A stony city of towers and enclosures, built entirely without mortar, stood as evidence of engineering mastery so advanced that when European explorers first encountered it in the 1800s, they refused to believe black people, black Africans, had built it. Rather, they invented a story, a lost white tribe story, which used to occupy Great Zimbabwe. Anything rather than admit what was obvious, that Africans had built something magnificent. So at the end of the day, this was not empty land. This was not a wilderness waiting for civilization. This was home. And then everything changed in 1888. A man named Cecil John Rhodes arrived, armed with a fraudulent mining concession signed under duress by King Lobengula of the Ndebele state, who later said he never agreed to surrender his land. Rhodes used this document as a legal cover to unleash the British South African Company's private army. By 1890, the pioneer column had merged into Mashonaland. And by 1893, after the First Matabele War, the Ndebele kingdom was crushed. It was reduced to rubble. By 1896, the land known as Rhodesia, named after Rhodes himself, was under firm colonial control.
They are not farmers anyway. In the way I know them, they are not farmers. They are just people who have resources. A farmer is me, who spends the day in the field, who will tell him, I need this, we want that portion. He's just going by. Leave it to me, and I'll do the right thing.
White settlers were handed farms, enormous farms, fertile land, the best land, the richest soil. The land near water was surveyed and divided and handed to Europeans who had no ancestral connection to it whatsoever. Meanwhile, the Shona and Ndebele were pushed into what became known as the tribal trust lands. Dry, rocky, overcrowded, infertile land. By the mid-20th century, Fewer than 6,000 white farmers owned more than 15 million hectares of Zimbabwe's best agricultural land. Meanwhile, over 700,000 black farming families were put into areas with the soil that could barely sustain them.
Yeah, right now they say you are not allowed to plow anything in the compound. Well, they say this is a state land. You mustn't plow anything, you mustn't grow anything there. So if you don't plant maize, there's hunger.
Remember this number: 6,000 white farmers owned 15 million hectares. And pay attention, everything that follows after this, every crisis, every sanction, every international outrage traces back to this single devastating fact that only 6,000 white farmers owned millions, I would say millions, of hectares of land. The promise they made and never kept. Fast forward to 1979, the Liberation War is ending after 15 years of brutal guerrilla conflict. After the sacrifices of ZANU and ZAP fighters, after thousands of deaths, after international pressure, Rhodesia was slowly dying. In September of 1979, representatives of the Rhodesian government, the Patriotic Front led by Robert Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo, and the British government sat down at the Lancaster House in London. The goal to negotiate the terms of Zimbabwe's independence. Now here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the seeds of everything that came later were planted. The liberation fighters knew that the land was the central issue. It had always been the central issue. The war was fought for the land. People had died for the land. The people of Zimbabwe expected land to be returned. But Britain and America had a problem with that, because the white Rhodesian farmers, many of whom held British citizenship, were not going to simply hand over their properties to black Africans. And at the end of the day, Cold War politics happening in Western countries meant Western governments needed a solution that protected white property while appearing to support black majority rule. The solution they invented was elegant in its cruel form. It was called willing seller, willing buyer. The agreement stipulated that land reform would happen, but only through voluntary market transactions. White farmers who wanted to sell could sell. The Zimbabwean government could buy at a market price, and Britain promised to provide funds to finance these purchases. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Underneath, it was a trap for Zimbabwe. Because if a white farmer did not want to sell, they did not have to. If the market price was too high, the land stayed with the white farmer. If Britain delayed or reduced its funding, the whole program ground to a halt. And that is exactly what happened. Zimbabwe gained independence on April 18, 1980.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, do swear that I will well and truly serve Zimbabwe in the office of Minister of the Government.
The streets of Harare, then called Salisbury, erupted in celebration. Bob Marley performed at the independence ceremony. It was supposed to be the dawn of a new era, and for a while it seemed like it. Mugabe, whatever history would later make of him, gave a remarkable speech promising reconciliation between black Africans and white farmers who were staying in Zimbabwe back then, Rhodesia. He promised that the white farmers would be protected. He extended an arm of support that shocked many of his own liberation war comrades. For 20 years, Zimbabwe tried to work within the Lancaster House framework. Land was purchased slowly, inadequately. Britain paid some funds, never fast enough, I would say. And then in 1997, a newly elected British Labour government under Tony Blair did something that would change everything. They wrote a letter to Zimbabwe's government and said, I should make it clear that we do not accept that Britain has a special responsibility to meet the cost of land purchase in Zimbabwe. We are a new government from diverse backgrounds, without links to former colonial interests. This reached Mugabe and it felt like a heartbreak. a slap in the face. Think about what just happened here. Britain, who had negotiated the Lancaster House Agreement, Britain, who had promised funding as a condition of Zimbabwe accepting a market-based land reform, Britain, who had created the colonial land disposition in the first place, simply walked away and then had the audacity to say it wasn't their problem. If you want to understand why Zimbabwe's land invasions began in 2000, start with that letter that was sent to the government of Zimbabwe back then. Start with the Britain washing its hands of a promise it had made as the price of peace, the uprising, and the point of no return. By the late 1990s, Zimbabwe was a pressure cooker. The war veterans did not wait for permission. The war vets, the men and women who had fought in the liberation struggle, had been waiting for 20 years. 20 years of watching the land their comrades had died for still being worked by white farmers. They felt like foreigners in their own land. 20 years of watching the government promise change and deliver very little. 20 years of poverty, unemployment, and humiliation. And in 1997, Mugabe's government, facing political pressure, granted them a pension package that crushed the Zimbabwean dollar, which was powerful back then. The economy was already fracturing. Mugabe did what he did to maintain a good relationship with his own people, the war vets, and at the same time maintaining a good relationship with the Western countries. But still, unemployment was rising. Inflation was creeping upward. Then came the referendum. In February 2000, Mugabe's government put forward a new constitution that would acquire land without compensation. What happened next was not planned, or at least that's what the official record says. War vets began invading white-owned farms. Not waiting for law, not waiting for courts, not waiting for Lancaster House. They just went all in. Farm invasions swept across Zimbabwe at that time. By some counts, within months, thousands of farms had been occupied. Truth be told, there was violence. I was still a kid back then. There was death on both sides. But significantly more black Zimbabweans died in this period than white farmers. Though you would never know that from the Western news coverage. They would never cover that. They would just tell you white farmers are being abused in Zimbabwe. Pay attention to this because it is important for everything that comes after. When the farm invasions began, the international media descended on Zimbabwe. And the story they told was almost entirely the story of the white farmers. Their fear, their losses. Now, those fears were real. Those losses that they were explaining on TV, they were real. No one should minimize genuine human suffering here. But ask yourself, where was the cameras for the 60 years of black Zimbabwean dispossession? Where was the documentaries about families living on eroded, overcrowded communal land? Where was the prime time interviews with the black Zimbabweans who had been a servant on a farm their grandfather owned? The narrative was set before the cameras ever arrived. In 2000, Mugabe's government launched the first track land reform program. It was chaotic. It was brutal in places. Some would say it was poorly administered, but ordinary Zimbabweans were tired and they did not care. Farms were seized, not just from commercial white farmers, but sometimes from black farmers too. Infrastructure was damaged, equipment was destroyed, and agricultural output collapsed, and all of this is true. Every honest account of Zimbabwe's land reform must say this. But here's the question that people never asked. Did the chaos of the reform cause Zimbabwe's economic collapse, or did the Western response to the reform cause it? Please understand this question, because the timeline tells a very specific story, and that story is what this chapter that is following is about. The punishment begins. The introduction of Zidera. Let us be very clear about what happened and in what order, because the order matters more than almost anything else in this story. The farm invasions began February 2000. By April 2000, the European Union had begun discussions about targeted measures towards Zimbabwe. By 2000, my people, the United States Congress had drafted a piece of legislation, and in December 2001, President George Bush signed it into law. It was called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA, and it would become one of the most brutal pieces of the legislation ever aimed at any African country. Let's break down what ZIDERA actually did to Zimbabwe, because if you only read the headlines, you would think it was a narrow travel ban on a few officials of Zimbabwe, but it was not. Section 4C of ZIDERA instructed the United States Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund to oppose any IMF program for Zimbabwe. It instructed the US Director at all other international financial institutions, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to vote against any assistance for Zimbabwe. Do you understand what that means? The United States government, the most powerful shareholder in these institutions that I just mentioned, instructed every representative in every major international financial body to block Zimbabwe from accessing credit, loans. Financial war was erected around an entire country of 12 million people. There were pre-existing economic problems, that is true, but Zimbabwe also had a functioning healthcare system. It had one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. It had a functioning agricultural sector, and Zimbabwe was once called the breadbasket of Africa. Zimbabwe had a currency, very strong. And then the world closed the financial door. Everything changed. Without the IMF support, Zimbabwe could not restructure its debt. Without World Bank loans, it could not finance infrastructure. So after all of this, the government of Zimbabwe had no choice, but had only one option, and that is print money. By 2004, inflation was at 133% in Zimbabwe. By 2007, it was at 66,000%. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's Central Statistical Office recorded a monthly inflation rate of 9.6 billion%. That is a huge number. Let that sink in with you. 79.6 million% inflation in a single month. Now, that is a country being punished because they were tired of feeling like foreigners in their own country. So prices were doubling every 24 hours in Zimbabwe. Salaries worth nothing by the time workers received them. And that's the time everyone became a billionaire in Zimbabwe. But look, this is what happens to the people. The ordinary teachers, the nurses, bus drivers, market women of Zimbabwe, the ones who had nothing to do with land policy, the ones who had never owned a farm, the ones who were simply alive in the wrong country at the wrong time. The people paid the price. Did the sanctions cause hyperinflation? Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but Mugabe's government was corrupt. They were mismanaging funds. They were looting the country. That's what people would say. But who amongst you dare to point a finger? Who dare raise a hand and say, my country has no corruption? I'll wait. Even the great America has its own big problems right now. Epstein files. This has proven that a lot had happened in America for the past 20 years and no one knew. They were committing crimes. But here's the thing about ZIDERA that its architects understood, and those are the Western countries. And they understood that when you cut off a government's access to international finance and external credit, you don't just punish the government. You make it impossible for the government to adjust. Zimbabwe at that time was a government that was told by the United States Congress that every international financial institution should deny its assistance. ZIDERA became a sledgehammer aimed at an entire economy, and the people who swung that sledgehammer knew exactly what it would hit. When everything that was happening at that time, In Zimbabwe, saving money was not a financial plan. It was a financial suicide, because money saved was money destroyed. At that time, you started to think in foreign currency, the US dollar, the South African rand, but accessing those foreign currency was a crime. So you deal in the black market, hiding US dollars in mattresses, living like a criminal simply to survive. So the healthcare system began to collapse in 2008. Nurses, doctors, and other health workers left in the hundreds of thousands. Zimbabwe, which had trained some of the best medical professionals in Southern Africa, watched its hospitals empty. Not because the buildings fell, not because the equipment disappeared, but because a nurse's monthly salary could no longer buy a day's worth of food. Cholera outbreak in 2008 killed over 4,000 people in Zimbabwe. It was a disease of the 19th century, my people. Preventable, treatable. But when water sanitation infrastructure is underfunded for years because international financing has been blocked, when hospitals have no medicine because the government cannot afford imports, the 19th century comes back. It came back to Zimbabwe really fast. Let me tell you what the United Nations said about the Zimbabwe cholera crisis back then. The UN coordinator on the ground in 2008 said that the outbreak was a direct consequence of the collapse of the essential services. Between 2000 and 2008, an estimated 3 million Zimbabweans left their country. Out of the population of roughly 13 million back then, that is nearly 1 in 4 people, if I'm not mistaken. They went to South Africa, where many were met with xenophobic violence. They went to Botswana, to the UK, to Australia, to the United States. They left behind elderly parents, young children, empty houses, unattended fields. So in the diaspora, Zimbabwean doctors started driving taxis in Johannesburg, teachers cleaning hotels in London, engineers working construction sites in Sydney, Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Is Sydney in Australia? Their remittances, the money they sent home, kept Zimbabwe alive. In a country where the currency was worthless and the government was paralyzed, it was the nurse in Cape Town sending $200 a month that kept grandmothers eating in Harare, Zimbabwe. It was a teacher in Manchester sending £300 that kept children in school. The diaspora became Zimbabwe's shadow central bank. And nobody in Washington or Brussels mentioned it, because mentioning it would mean acknowledging the human cost of what they had done. Here is a question, a simple, direct, unavoidable question. When South Africa ended apartheid and began land reform discussions, did the West impose Zidera-style sanctions on them? No. When South Korea rebuilt from the Korean War using land redistribution as a central development tool, did Western governments block their access to international credit? No. In fact, they funded it. Let's go further. In 1953, the United States and its allies orchestrated a debt conference in London. Germany, which had started 2 world wars, whose aggression had killed 60 million people, was given extraordinary debt relief. So half of West Germany's debt was cancelled right away. Germany, a country that had perpetrated the Holocaust, it was given a debt relief, financial support, and access to international markets. But Zimbabwe, an African country, a country that had redistributed land stolen during colonialism, was given sanctions, financial blockade, and economic isolation. Consider also this. At the very moment Zidera was being debated in the US Congress, the United States at that time was writing blank checks to Saudi Arabia, a country with no elections, no free press, no independent judiciary, a country that had beheaded more people in 2001 than Zimbabwe had prosecuted white farmers. Countries with documented human rights abuses far exceeding anything in Zimbabwe, all receiving US aid, IMF support, World Bank loans, all welcomed into the international financial community. What Zimbabwe means for every African nation. Here's the message that was sent, not just to Harare, but to Nairobi, to Lusaka, to Pretoria, to Accra, to every African capital where land reform was being discussed. Remember, Land reform was not only being discussed in Zimbabwe. The message was, do not touch the land, do not touch the farms, do not disrupt the ownership structures we put in place during colonialism. Because if you do, we will cut you off, we will block your loans, we will support your opposition, we will collapse your currency. And then we will stand before our cameras and tell the world that you did it to yourself. There is a generation of Zimbabweans, brilliant, educated, talented, who grew up in the diaspora, who did not get to grow up in the country their parents built, who did not learn their mother's tongues properly. They are grandmothers in rural Zimbabwe who survived hyperinflation by growing their own food, who buried children who died from preventable diseases during the cholera years, who never once read Zidera, who never once appeared on CNN, who simply endured the whole thing. And they are white Zimbabwean farmers also, some of them third and fourth generation, born here in Zimbabwe, knowing no other home, who lost farms they genuinely considered home. Some of them innocent of the original dispossession. Some of them genuinely good people caught in the undertow of a historical crime they did not personally commit. Their pain was real too, and is real. By the time the reckoning arrives, the original criminals are long dead. And the suffering falls on people who simply happen to be born in a world which they don't understand what really happened. That is what colonialism does. That is what stolen land does. In 2009, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency, the Zimbabwe dollar. Once a proud symbol of a newly independent nation, became worthless. The country adopted a multi-currency system, primarily the US dollar. Inflation stopped overnight, but the damage was already done. But here is what I want you to take from this story. The next time a Western government talks about democracy in Africa, ask them what they did to Zimbabwe. The next time an economist tells you that African countries fail because of bad governance, ask them what Zidera did to Zimbabwe's ability to govern. The land of Zimbabwe was stolen. The people tried to take it back, and the most powerful nations on earth said, not while we are watching. They did not send armies. They did not need to. They did not need to. They had something more powerful than armies. They had the IMF. They had the World Bank. They had the power to choose. They had the power to close every financial door on a continent that was already fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this far, and thank you for supporting the channel. When I was making this video, I knew it won't go viral because it's a sensitive topic and YouTube won't push it to a wider audience. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for reaching this far, and please like the video. It really helps the channel, and subscribe if you are new. Thank you.